I'm Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, and my guest today is Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who is currently serving her fourth term representing Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District. Her election in 2012 made history in several ways. The first Samoan American and Hindu American to be elected to Congress, and now she's the first of each seeking her party's nomination, the Democratic Party nomination for president in 2020. Congresswoman, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
It's great to be here, Glenn. Aloha.
So in 2016, that was when you really rose to full-scale national prominence, and it was in connection with your announcement that you were leaving the DNC, in part because of your view that turned out to be extremely vindicated, that the leadership under Debbie Wasserman Schultz was not being neutral but favoring Hillary Clinton, and also because you wanted to support Bernie Sanders for president. That candidate you supported in 2016, Bernie Sanders, is running again this year. So why is it that you decided not to support him, but to run instead? And I guess maybe a better way of asking that is, given how large the field is of candidates who are running that span the spectrum, Senator Sanders, Senator Warren, so many others, what would this primary race be lacking if Tulsi Gabbard weren't running in it?
Well, I made this decision to run for president long before Bernie Sanders made his own decision that he was going to run. Had a conversation with him when I decided that this was what I was going to do, and shared with him the reasons why, because there are such incredible issues at stake as it relates to our country's foreign policy, to our national security, and how destructive the decades-long policy of ongoing regime change wars has been for the United States, for people in the countries where we wage these wars, the cost it has, the toll it has taken.
But are there no other candidates, including he, who share your views on that topic?
There's no one else. As you look at even how crowded this race has become, still no one else is really taking these issues head on and addressing the fact that the most important job that the president has is as commander-in-chief. And this is why I'm running, because as president, I will end these regime change wars, work to end this new Cold War that we're in with ever-increasing tensions between the United States and nuclear-armed countries like Russia and China, and work to end this nuclear arms race that is presenting a serious threat to our very existence.
So I want to spend the bulk of our time talking about foreign policy, in part because, as you just said, that's the focus of your campaign, and it ties inextricably to our domestic policy as well, for reasons you've been articulating. But before I do that, I just want to kind of go through a quick laundry list of what I understand your positions to be on some of the conventional domestic policy debates, because people like to place ideological labels on people that, to me at least, seem rather incoherent and unhelpful. But for those who do like to do that, I just want to share with you my views of what I understand your position to be on a lot of these issues, just quickly, and let me know if I'm wrong about any of them. You're pro-choice. You support full LGBT equality, including gay marriage. You were a supporter of Obamacare, but criticized it on the grounds that it didn't go far enough. You opposed its repeal. You support Medicare for all as a means of providing universal health care. You support a national $15 an hour minimum wage. You are opposed to nuclear energy. You support free community college for everybody and free college for people whose family earns under a certain income level. You supported significant reforms to NSA spying in the wake of the Snowden revelations. And you also have sponsored legislation or co-sponsored legislation to restrict the ability to buy certain kinds of weapons and for background checks on gun purchases. Is that an accurate summary of your views on a lot of domestic policy debates? So I wanted to ask you about one in particular, which didn't get a lot of attention outside of a lot of left-wing media circles, though it deserved to, which were the protests by Native Americans at Standing Rock. The Intercept covered it, Democracy Now! Covered it, several other media outlets covered it, but not very many. You not only expressed support for the protesters who were opposing the pipeline that was being proposed to be built, but actually traveled to North Dakota to stand with them. Just talk a little bit about what that cause was to you, and why you found it important enough to actually go there and participate.
Well, one of the things that inspired me, just even as a teenager, to look outside of my own small world in Hawaii was the issue of water. protecting our water, keeping it clean. And growing up in Hawaii, it was just a matter of, going and playing in the ocean every day. This was our playground, and understanding and appreciating how important it is to protect both our natural resources, but also our drinking water. And so that has been a passion of mine since I was a kid. And so when I started to learn about what was happening at Standing Rock, and the mantra, the rallying cry of all those, the tens of thousands of people who gathered from across the country there, water is life. That struck such a deep and personal note with me. And then when I had the opportunity to go there as a part of a call to action with veterans from across the country, it was so inspiring to see people from different political parties, races, backgrounds, all different, bringing so much that was unique around this same mission of protecting our water, because unless we do that, we have nothing. It was truly inspiring to be there and just to be a part of that.
So obviously, if you're running for president, as you are, it's impossible to avoid talking about the person who currently occupies that office,
Yeah.
Donald Trump. There is still an ongoing debate about why, despite being one of the most unpopular candidates in American history ever to run, he won in 2016. And the debate tends to get polarized along this binary line of, did he win because people are racist and xenophobic, or did they win because they have anxiety about their economic future? What is your view about that debate, but more importantly, for people who are interested in finding an alternative that can actually beat him this time, what is it that they need to understand about what his political appeal was and continues to be, and how that can be defeated?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, because I think we've seen too many Democratic leaders in Washington not take the time to reach out, ask, and listen and hear and try to understand why there were enough people who voted for Donald Trump that got him elected, or enough people who stayed home and waited out that election. I know that what I have heard from folks is a few things. They felt left behind by the entire system, by both political parties, or they felt like the Democratic Party was not reaching out and hearing about those concerns and those challenges, even coming from people who had voted Democrat.
Why is that? Why didn't they feel that, and what needs to be done to make that, to rectify that?
Ultimately, when you look at the different things, ultimately it comes down to politicians putting themselves or their own political power ahead of the interests of the people. That's really what it comes down to. When you start taking people for granted, when you're not interested in what they care about, the challenges that they and their families are going through, it's because you have self-serving politicians who are more interested in what they have going on rather than the people who we as elected leaders have been charged to serve. That's what's at the heart of these problems that we have seen.
So one of the things that the Democratic Party and the Washington political media class have done to explain away Trump's victory is to try and blame everybody else they can find. The Russians did it,
Yeah.
WikiLeaks did it, the New York Times did it, and yet Trump is clearly part of a international trend, maybe unique in some ways, but clearly similar in other ways to things like the UK's decision to leave the EU, the rise of extremist parties in Europe, authoritarian leaders like Duterte in the Philippines, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, where I'm from. Do you see Trump as part of a global trend in the democratic world? And if so, how do you look at that trend? What is it that you see?
You see corporate interests and the very wealthy or the very powerful having been in control for so long and being so detached from the everyday needs and challenges and hopes and aspirations of everyday people, both across our country, and you're seeing this rising up from people in different parts of the world because of that disconnect, because you have people in positions of power who are more interested in maintaining that power than they are actually interested in connecting with and serving the needs of the people that they are charged to serve with.
Do you see that trend that I described as being an opportunity, as being menacing, as being dangerous? How do you view that trend?
I think it should be seen as a wake-up call. It should be seen as a wake-up call to leaders here in the United States of America and leaders in other parts of the world that we've got to make sure that our leaders are actually serving the interests of the people, putting the welfare and the interests of the people ahead of the corporate interests and the greedy that have ruled for too long. You see this evident in the kinds of massive trade deals like TPP. The massive trade deals that we've seen have had such a detrimental impact on people, while the corporations who were a part of crafting these deals end up making a lot more money and profiting on our backs, on the backs of the people.
Would you agree the places that were often hardest hit by a lot of these policies that are often called neoliberalism or globalism and the like were exactly the states that the Democrats lost that caused Trump to win in 2016?
Yeah, you see a correlation there.
Now, let me ask you about something I wish we could avoid, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about, which is what the Democrats have largely spent their energies on messaging-wise and politically over the last 3 years, which is what we'll call Russiagate for shorthand. The original conspiracy theory was that Donald Trump conspired with the Russians to meddle in the 2016 election and himself was either a Russian agent or at least a Russian asset of Vladimir Putin and Moscow. There's been a 22-month investigation that culminated in the Mueller report that said that it could not find evidence to establish this conspiracy theory. A colleague of yours in the House, Adam Schiff, has taken the lead in assuring Americans for almost 3 years that he's seen direct evidence of this conspiracy that Mueller, with all the subpoena power in the world, couldn't find. And even with the Mueller report now issued, it seems that it's still ongoing with all kinds of ancillary controversies. What is your view? I mean, obviously, everybody agrees we should fortify our election system from interference, that we should have paper ballot backups and things of that. So put that to the side because it's not really in controversy. But in terms of what the Democrats did in backing behind this conspiracy theory that in some sense was at least debunked by the Mueller report and don't really seem like they're ready to move on, what is your view on all that?
Well, two things. First of all, I don't think we should sweep aside the necessity to protect our elections infrastructure so quickly, because the fact is, how many years have gone by since 2016 or 3 years later, and still there's been no legislation passed or action taken by Congress or the administration to harden our elections infrastructure. We remain extremely vulnerable to either a foreign country or a bad actor or whoever coming in and actually hacking into our systems and changing the votes that we cast. This is the biggest threat to our 2020 elections and to our democracy.
So do you favor paper ballot backups?
Yes, I've introduced legislation, the Securing America's Elections Act. It is a very simple, very direct bill that would simply say, hey, you need to either use paper ballots or have a voter verified paper backup so that we can audit the votes that are cast in case there is some kind of interference or manipulation of our votes. So I want to make sure that that's important because Congress refuses to take action, which begs the question, are they more interested in just talk or actually solving the problem? And it is the former, given the fact that this bill or any other bill like it has not been brought forward.
And then what do you see as the political but also the international repercussions of this? You mentioned earlier this Cold War between the U.S. and nuclear powers, but also in terms of democratic messaging. How do you view the last 3 years in terms of the Democrats' bet on this conspiracy theory?
We can't understate the dangerous repercussions of this new Cold War that we find ourselves in, with ever-increasing tensions between the United States and Russia. You know, people forget, unfortunately, that we still have nuclear-armed missiles pointed at each other, still on hair trigger alert. So the fact that we are in this place now where we're at a greater risk of nuclear catastrophe than ever before in history is a direct consequence of the fact that our leaders have failed us.
And in light of the Mueller report, which I assume you've read at least part of, if not all of, do you believe that Donald Trump and his closest circle did in fact conspire with the Russian government to meddle in the 2016 election?
The Mueller report made clear that there was no evidence of collusion. And I think that for those of us who supported this investigation, because for any president of the United States to have been found guilty of colluding with another foreign country or operating as a proxy of another country's leader, this is extremely dangerous for us as a country. So the fact that Mueller report came out, no evidence of collusion, that's a good thing for America. And it is a great thing for us to see our opportunity now come together Let's come together, set this aside, and actually focus on the issues that people in this country are worried about. And I tell you what, Glenn, several months I've been out visiting communities in different parts of the country, holding town hall meetings, sitting in living rooms and around kitchen tables. Only once, probably in the last 5 or 6 months, has anyone asked a question about the Mueller report or Russia or
Bill Barr
else.
or Putin or any of that.
No.
So let's talk about some of the things that your campaign is focused on.
Yeah.
As somebody who is challenging the pieties of the bipartisan foreign policy community, you're subjected to a lot of what I regard as smears that I actually do want to give you a chance to address in a little bit, but don't want to spend a lot of time on because I think they're facially invalid.
It's been overdone.
but I do want to ask you about some of the concerns that I think are being raised in good faith by people who share your anti-war disposition. And I think you can divide them roughly into 2 critiques, one of which is that some of your philosophies and policy positions over the years have demonstrated what one might call a hostility toward Islam and Muslims, or exaggerating the threat that it poses, and the other being an affinity for repressive leaders, particularly ones whose repression is aimed at Muslims. So they're interrelated. And I want to talk about some of the specific statements and policies that have led to this concern. But before I do, I just want to ask you, in general, what is your view of Islam and Muslims in general, and the threat that they pose relative to other threats to U.S. security?
I just would disagree with the premise of the question, saying that people who practice the religion of Islam or Muslims pose a threat. That's not valid, and it's not true. I've been very specific in pointing out the ideology that drives terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and how important it is for us as these terrorist groups pose a threat for us to understand that ideology.
What is that ideology?
That most extreme, most intolerant, twisted form of Islam known as Wahhabi Salafist ideology that basically preaches exclusivism, that whether you are Christian or Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, or even Muslim, if you do not adhere to that extreme ideology, then you either will be killed or raped or tortured or whatever the tactics that they use.
So I guess
this is the ideology that Saudi Arabia is propagating and spending billions of dollars in doing so around the world, and that provides that fertile recruiting ground for these different terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab and ISIS and others.
Is the ideology and the things that are fueling that violence, in your view, based in an ideology related to this twisted or extremist form of Islam, or however you want to define it? Or is it driven by and fueled by U.S. interference in that region?
It's driven by this ideology. And you can see that there is also a link to the United States regime change wars that have strengthened these very same terrorist groups in places like Iraq and Libya and Syria. So they're 2 separate but related issues.
Well, I mean, like, for example, if you ask Al-Qaeda or you ask Osama bin Laden, as people did, not U.S. media but other media, what was the cause of 9/11, he won't say it was Islam. He will say it was U.S. sanctions against Iraq that killed 500,000 people, or U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia, or the oppression of Palestinians through aid to the Israelis. Do you believe, whether that's the principal cause or one of the causes, that is in fact motivating either these groups or the support they're able to attract in that region?
Yeah, like I said, I think the 2 are related.
So one of the objections that people have to, or concerns that people have when you say that your problem is with these exclusionary ideologies, is that it seems to be applied in some cases but not others. And so one of the cases that people cite are some of the statements that you've made about the Prime Minister of India. And I think you can look at repressive leaders and kind of have 3 different approaches. You can say it should be the goal of the United States, when there's a repressive leader in the world, to overthrow that leader and change the regime, which is sort of what neocons pretend to believe, although they don't believe it very consistently, but it's what they say they believe. That's what they're saying now about what they're doing in Venezuela. There's repression. We have to liberate the people of that country. There's a second view that says there's repressive people in the world, leaders in the world. We don't support them. We don't admire them. We don't praise them, but we deal with them. We sit down with them. We try and get along with them. We try and work constructively with them. I think that was more or less what Obama's position was. That was a lot of the ideology of the U.S. policy during the Cold War. And then there's this third category that Donald Trump is in and that a lot of other Cold Warriors were in, like Henry Kissinger, that says it's not just that we're neutral about these repressive leaders. We actually admire them. We like them. We want to praise them and say that they should be emulated. When it comes to Prime Minister Modi of India, and I don't want to force you to be in these categories, but where on that spectrum do you fall in terms of your view of who he is and what U.S. policy toward him should be?
Yeah, well, look, like President Obama and like many other leaders in Congress, throughout my tenure as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee as well as the Armed Services Committee for over 6 years, recognized the strong partnership between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy. So I was also co-chair of the U.S.-India caucus for 2 years in Congress, the largest bipartisan and bicameral caucus in Congress, focused on strengthening and building those relationships. So again, like President Obama and many other leaders, I met with Prime Minister Modi when I visited India. I also met with leaders from his opposition party in the Congress Party and have done so numerous times back here in the United States, understanding that even as the partisan winds blow, both here in the United States as well as in India, that relationship between our two countries is important. It's important for the American people
I guess
and our interests.
And so one of the reasons why I put those categories in there was because your answer was, well, we should have constructive relations with India. And yet you've had statements before that seem to me at least to go beyond that. In a 2016 interview with Quartz, for example, you said, after describing the benefits of the United States and India's growing friendship, you said, Modi impressed me as a person who cares deeply about these issues and as a leader whose example and dedication to the people he serves should be an inspiration to elected officials everywhere. That seems to be pretty strong praise for Modi as a leader, as opposed to simply saying we should try and get along well with India. Do you believe, you said earlier that you have a problem with Muslim governments that are exclusionary or discriminatory or who persecute minorities. Do you believe the government of India persecutes Muslims and other religious minorities in India?
I would have, first of all, on that quote, I'd have to go back and look at the context of the conversation to comment on that specifically. There are things that are happening within the Indian government that I disagree with. I don't pretend to support or approve of or endorse all the practices of the ruling party in India. As we look at different governments around the world, again, I think my approach is looking at serving what is in the best interest of the American people, being willing to sit with others, whether they be friends or adversaries or potential adversaries, always keeping at the forefront who I work for and who I serve.
Right. So, and I've heard you say before, and I think there's an element of truth to it, that your ability to say things about the Indian government that non-Hindus say get more attention, and that's a form of religious bigotry, which I do agree with. Is. At the same time, I'm interested in understanding a little bit better what your view of the government of India is, because you have spoken a lot about it and you've met with the Prime Minister, and that quote that I read, and there's others like it, seem to suggest that you at least view him as a positive leader. So I just wanted to ask you, in 2018, an Indian journalist, Rana Aya, wrote in The Guardian under the title, "Mobs are killing Muslims in India. Why is no one stopping them?" She wrote, "This is encouraged by Modi's government, which routinely disseminates fake news targeting and demonizing Indian Muslims." The New York Times just 2 weeks ago, after the massacre in the church in Sri Lanka, said, quote, "In India, the Hindu right, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has targeted Muslim and Christian minorities, the latter because of its symbolic association with colonialism." And then Human Rights Report in 2018 has a long list of human rights abuses that it says have been perpetrated by the Modi government, primarily against the Muslim minority. So my question to you is, do you agree that that's happening or dispute that it's happening, or do you admire Modi despite all of this?
I don't dispute that these things are occurring, and I've been very consistent over the years in calling out this kind of religious persecution and bigotry based on religion wherever it may take place. I think that's important for all of us to do, whether it's happening here in the United States or it's happening in other parts of the world.
And would that include other leaders like General Sisi in Egypt and Bashar al-Assad, people who you've been accused, I think in the case of Assad at least, of praising? Do you agree that they too are repressive leaders against religious minorities within their own country?
Again, those whatever the accusations are, they're false. I want to be clear that both before I went to Syria as well as after I came back, my message has been consistent about the detrimental and devastating impacts of U.S.-led regime change wars and why we need to stop, why the U.S. in the case of Syria needs to stop spending U.S. taxpayer dollars funding and equipping and arming terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda in Syria, who were attacking religious minorities, who were, bombing churches and killing Christians in Syria.
Should the U.S. be taking action to keep Assad in place, or simply stay out of Syria
The U.S.
altogether?
should stay out. The U.S. should stay out.
And what about with Egypt? Should they be supporting General Sisi in Egypt? Or
the U.S. needs to stay out. The United States government needs to stop interfering in these other countries' elections and determining who should or shouldn't be the leaders of these countries. Every time throughout history our country has done that, we have seen disastrous consequences, both for us, for our national security, and long-lasting negative impacts for the people in these countries. They have to be the ones to determine their own style of government, their own constitutional changes, and who they want to lead their country.
So let me ask you this what one might call a paradox of your campaign, although maybe it isn't, which is that you're running as a peace candidate, you're talking about peace dividends, and yet you're one of your most famous iconic quotes is, "I'm a dove on regime change wars, but a hawk when it comes to fighting terrorism." I completely understand the dove part of the regime change war, but tell me, if you could please, the sense in which you describe yourself as a hawk. Do you support the prongs of the war on terror that haven't been about regime change, but have been things about drone assassination, even of American citizens, about Guantanamo? What is it? What is your hawkishness when it comes to the war on terror?
Al-Qaeda attacked us on 9/11, killing thousands of Americans. We have continued to see that threat that is posed by terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This is not a war that we chose, but it is a threat that continues, and we cannot just turn our backs and pretend as though it doesn't exist. So when I say that I'm a hawk on fighting against terrorism, it is against these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Our national security is important. Keeping the American people safe is the #1 job that the president has.
And so just the last question, our time is running out. If you exclude things like Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, the regime change wars that you vehemently oppose and have consistently opposed, has the U.S. government done a good job in fighting against those groups? Do you believe it should have been more belligerent and militaristic? Has it been too militaristic? What's your assessment of that part of the war that you believe requires hawkishness against the groups that attacked us on 9/11?
I don't think that the United States government has done a good job, because we find ourselves in a place today where Al-Qaeda is stronger now than they ever have been before. And you look at Syria as the foremost example. I introduced the Stop Arming Terrorists Act because our government was using our taxpayer dollars to literally strengthen Al-Qaeda in Syria. Why? So that they could go and fulfill this regime change war, which was really the objective in Syria, led by the United States since 2011. Then you have Al-Qaeda now holed up and controlling the entire city of Idlib in Syria. Once again, this is their stronghold. And when, whether it was Russia or Syria or some of the other countries who are heavily involved in the ongoing conflict in Syria said, we need to go after Al-Qaeda in Idlib, this administration said, no, don't you dare. And if you do, we'll attack you as a result, basically protecting that al-Qaeda stronghold in Idlib. So these are a couple of I think, many examples of how this mission that was begun after the attack on 9/11 has not been waged properly, and it is these regime change war policies that have helped to strengthen these terrorist groups, leading us to the position that we're in today.
So I think your candidacy is raising some incredibly important issues, and you have a lot of heterodoxical positions that deserve a lot more debate and discussion than I wish that we have time for today, because you're on your way to Hawaii for National Guard duty. But I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to me, and I'd love to find some more time and explore some of these issues as your campaign unfolds.
I look forward to it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.